Surprise! I could not stay away during Candidate Month, and in my defense, one of the biggest pieces of news came about over last weekend. President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela was kidnapped, extradited, captured, whichever verb you'd like to use, from Venezuela by American forces, brought back to the United States to stand trial on drug trafficking charges along with his wife. And I just couldn't stay away for that long. However, I am not an expert on South American policy. I have a general idea of our long and troubled history in the area, but unfortunately in grad school and in college, my focus was on China, because silly me for thinking that we would focus on China. But anyways, because of my lack of knowledge, I thought I would bring on somebody who does know a thing or two about the area. Today's guest is Anthony Vernon. Now, you might remember Anthony from back in June when I posted the episode Fascism Drives a Truck Now. He very accurately and correctly called out Trump's fascist kind of drive into the world and putting the US at the bottom of the fascist slide. And I think he's a great guest that is able to explain what's going on in Venezuela and kind of offer a unique perspective. He is down in Miami, which has a large Venezuelan population, and just kind of the complexities about this, because I posted a video over the weekend, the day that it happened, that went viral on TikTok and Instagram, which has been insane in and of itself. But there are so many opinions swirling around, so much disinformation and fake videos going around that, I think it's important to break this issue down, one, to the basics, but two, to get the opinion of somebody that actually understands the issues at hand. But yeah, once you listen to the episode, are hoping that Anthony is not correct in his assumptions, but I do still think it's valuable insight. And, not that he's a fortune teller, but after he was right the first time, I'm a little convinced that he's going to hit this one on the nose. But first, a little refresher on who Anthony is. Anthony David Vernon is a professor of philosophy at Miami-Dade College and St. Thomas University, Miami Gardens. He's also a Cuban-American writer residing in South Florida. While his work focuses on social philosophy, he has written about Latin matters for the New English Review, the Rome Review, and Bouncin' and Behavin' blogs. Without further ado, here is my second conversation with Anthony. Anthony, welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. It is so great to have you on again.
Yeah, it's great to speak with you, not on the topic, but...
Yeah, it's a little dim and grim on the topic, but it's great to have you on again.
Yeah, to say the least. And one that's pretty, not literally close to home, but being someone that, is a resident of South Florida as a Cuban American, right? The diaspora is very, very close to home. And knowing individuals who have, family in Venezuela, and, there's a lot of certainly complications to this matter. Then I see those complications in front of me, and very uncertain times for, many individuals. There's lots of celebration. There's lots of concern about the future, lots of, emotions surrounding this, and, concerns for just lives in the future. Some of it's optimistic, some of it's pessimistic, some of it's all over the place, to say the least. So a lot of the framing is that Miami's thinking one way about this sort of event.
Right.
And that definitely is the majority sort of way of the celebrating of Maduro. I think that one is near universal in South Florida. But yeah, in regards to, beyond that, there is certainly tons of.
Don't worry, I feel you. I think there was a poll today that came out, the first initial poll, which probably doesn't carry much weight, but I think it was ABC, and they polled a bunch of Venezuelan people, and the excitement was greater in people that lived in the US, whereas kind of more trepidation and feeling nervous was coming from Venezuelans living in Venezuela, which I thought was very interesting.
Well, of course. Those within, the diaspora aren't going to be potentially facing the military activity. So of course there's going to be more trepidation. And, in, that, regard also, right? I think one of the things that kind of shocked me the most about the diaspora's response, I can understand the sole excitement over having Maduro ousted. But once Trump makes the statement of running the country, I would be like, whoa, 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 wait a second. Like,
Right.
what is going on here? And one of the people I think said this quite well, surprisingly, was Anna Navarro on The View, where, it's like, yeah, we should be mutually glad that the son of a bitch is out of the country. Someone who someone who is a journalist in Venezuela who had their life threatened, came to the United States, but then also went to an immigration hearing for the first time in their life and was concerned about being deported to Venezuela and then being killed. So it's that sort of thing of like, we have a fascist authority at the same time then making colonial statements, right? So what you have here, is someone who is an idiotic, thuggish authoritarian, and then you have, a regime that wants to be colonial fascist. And what you
Right.
have here is just a confluence of bad results, bad existences, and the people who are going to feel the most brunt of that are those not in the diaspora, but those individuals in the country. But that doesn't mean individuals in the diaspora won't feel pain. A different friend of mine, their mother, thankfully, was not in Caracas, but they live in Caracas, and him and his wife, who's not Venezuelan, the first thing they texted me is, "We're freaking out."
Yeah. It's a complicated topic, and it is dominating the headlines, but what happens so often when things dominate the headlines is you get opinions on every end, and typically, those opinions on both far ends of the spectrum are the ones that are the loudest and making the most waves, and you get a ton of mis and disinformation and fake videos and fake photos. So I'm eager to get into this and get a little bit more educated on South America and Venezuela.
I mean, I hope I can help in any big or small way, from the knowledge I will say is imperfect, but, I
Right.
do have an insight as a tepid member of the community. I'm
Right.
highly Americanized, but nonetheless, right, there is still a hopeful bridge I have there as a result.
So let's start, kind of from the beginning. For people that, are not familiar with Venezuela and don't really follow Venezuelan politics, can you walk us through how we get from Hugo Chavez to Nicolas Maduro and how that kind of brings us to what happened over the weekend?
Yeah, I think it's preferable to go back all the way to like Simone Bolivar, but I think, that might be a little too long. But in the, simplest summation to just, stick with Chavez as requested, right? What you basically have is Chavez being elected legally, right? There's no like fake
No
election,
funny
right?
business.
He runs on a, popular, campaign. And in that, right, at the time, Venezuela was a very wealthy, but it was a very wealth divided nation by South American standards. So he wins on a policy of wealth distribution. When he gets into office, he starts dismantling the powers of the Congress and the courts, like the equivalents in of Venezuela, and sets up a new Bolivarian republic eventually, where it's basically just a figurehead party to keep on having Chavez as the president elected, but not really. Now, at first, Chavez is extremely popular because he nationalizes U.S. oil, extracting facilities and other facilities run by United States companies, and he distributes that wealth to individuals. This system works out very well for a while, right? And Chavez is very popular. However, oil as a commodity drops in price. And when it drops in price, right, the whole thing starts declining. Chavez passes away, hands the reins to Maduro, who, unlike Chavez, right, you could say of Chavez horrible things as an individual, but you could not point to Chavez's idiocy. If you watch any Mega TV, which is very popular, well, I should say very relatively popular news station that, plays a lot in South Florida and I believe a little bit in New York City. There's a lot of clips on Mega TV, a Spanish network, that just point to the stupidity of Maduro again and again. It's comedic, unfortunately, in like the worst types of way. In the same sort of way individuals laugh at the stupid statements of Trump, this is just the case for Maduro again and again. So you have an individual who is not a savvy leader, but was chosen by Chavez because he was well connected to Chavez through multiple relationships with women in Maduro's life. So Maduro gets handpicked by Chavez, but inherits a situation that the petro state of national, distribution there is starting to already crumble. Maduro's mismanagement is extra. You get the hyper, inflation, right? You get the outrage within the country as a result that, by all intelligence that we have, people do not want Maduro to be in charge. He gets more and more brutal. And then, he makes a deal with Joe Biden that he's going to run an election. He's going to let Chevron have some of the facilities back, right? He makes a deal with the Biden administration. They run the election. It is seen as an illegitimate election by most of the world, right? Some countries say, yeah, it was perfectly fine, but ultimately a very contested, election in a situation that the Trump administration, even before the Biden deal, already wanted to go in and, denationalize all the oil stuff anyways for American companies. And now that the Trump administration is back in charge, not only do they want to do that, right? You have, a more blatant fascist group going on here. And it seems that there is this blatant desire for Venezuelan colonization. So I'm not sure if that's a perfect history, right? I'm sure individuals, may not be seeing that as a perfect frame, but I think it is a useful frame nonetheless to think about how you get a series of sort of mistrust of a government, and then you have an outside country, being the United States, taking interest as a result of a set of oil actions and ideological differences.
So I don't think I ever even realized that it went directly from Chavez to Maduro, which is, I kind of always just thought there was somebody in between them. Like, I didn't think that they were one after the other. But was there ever a time where Maduro was popular, or was he kind of always seen as this, for lack of a better word, buffoon?
Pretty much as the beginning. Like, he had a mango thrown at him, like, very close to his inauguration. And this was something John Oliver covered, like, very famously. So, yeah, Maduro was kind of always seen as like almost like equivalent to like a Nepo baby in a weird way. Like,
got it. Okay. And one of the things that keeps coming up is the election that happened last year that, like you mentioned, a lot of countries are saying it was corrupt and it was stolen, and the opposition leader had to flee the country. How did that election change Venezuela's relationship with the US and other global powers? Do you think it had some sort of deeper impact?
No, I think if you spoke to the Venezuelan diaspora, everyone knew the results, right? Like, in the community down here, everybody knew what was going to happen, right? All it was just a reaffirmation of everyone's beliefs surrounding Venezuela.
Okay. And so when Trump is repeatedly framing Venezuela as, we need to take the oil back, and at a certain point he was also like, we need to take the land back, which is crazy to me because it was never our land to begin with, but I digress. What is the background story there? Like, what is he talking about?
This one, I have to go much farther back, right? As much as I want to go back to Simón Bolívar, this one we need to actually go back to the Confederacy. So
of the U.S.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So during the Confederacy, some of its kind of more ambitious ideologues, to, in the most disgusting form of ambition, had this notion of a Caribbean empire for the Confederacy, the Knights of the Golden Circle, right? Their idea is that once they won the Civil War, right, that they would go invade, the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and, the lands that pertain, to, modern day Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, etc., right? So you have this notion of the United States wanting to take over Venezuela for its own advantage. Now, at the time, the Confederacy was not thinking in terms of oil because oil wasn't a usable commodity, right? The car industry wasn't really a thing, right? They're thinking more in terms of slave labor and agricultural production, right? So what we have is that as kind of the first unconscious seed. Then later on, you have this formative idea around the Second World War, a little bit before, a little bit afterwards, this notion of the technate of America, this fascist ideology that emerged that the United States should ditch democracy, be a technocracy, and a entirely North American technocracy, running not only the areas that the Golden Circle recommended, but also Canada and Greenland. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? There is that infamous tweet. It's hard to know how true it is about Elon Musk's grandfather being a believer in the technate of America. While we can't affirm that one for sure, there are certainly individuals connected to Peter Thiel that have this technocratic belief about the United States that, began its sort of line of thinking around the Second World War. And in this sort of sense, ways in which the United States has justified Venezuela, right, is through natural resources. Oh, we want it as a part of this larger empire because of the resources it had, whether it was agriculture, then later on, deposits of minerals, oil, etc. of the sort. So what you have at hand in this regard is this long sort of development. Obviously, individuals weren't as slavery idealistic or ideological, I should say, as the Confederacy, or as, nationalistically, fascistly ideological as those technate individuals, right? For a long time, the relationship with Venezuela was, Venezuela as a quote unquote partner state in South America, for better or for worse. Right? Well, these things weren't really thought of, but with the re-emergence of American fascism, the sort of notion of thinking about Venezuela as a colonial state certainly is on the table for many individuals in the ear of the current U.S. administration.
Do you think, is that a concern that we, are trying to turn Venezuela into the next Puerto Rico, say?
It's the path we're on. I don't think it's the concern. I think that's the idea here, right? When you come out and say, we're going to run the country, who's going to run it? The people behind me for an indefinite period of time. That is not the concern. That is the blatantly stated plan. What I think the problem has been with a lot of the media is we're thinking about the United States as a liberal state, right? We're thinking about it in neoconservative terms. But the liberalism and neoconservatism are masks for the true intentions of a fascist group, right? The neoconservative frame is to have partner states or vassal states in other areas, not direct occupation, right? Neoconservative, neocon warhawks, right, think in terms of the idea is to push global markets everywhere, right? Like, we need to have our markets throughout the world, right? Fascists are not necessarily against this, but fascists think in terms of direct occupation. And so, right, Trump is being framed as doing neocon regime change. No, because if he was doing the neocon regime change, it's let's run an election and have Machado run. But he says, no. Machado is not trusted by the people. And so you only say that if you have the intention of justifying your own continued control over the place, right? And again, there just so happens to be a picking of, places that the United States has within its sphere of influence and theoretically could hold militarily in, relatively easy terms, right? If we can bomb Afghanistan from Diego Garcia, then, certainly if the United States organize its resources, right, we could, in theory, militarily hold Venezuela, militarily hold Greenland.
Right. You mentioned the fact that Trump has said Machado can't run the country because she's not trusted by the country, what do you then make of the installing of the vice president and kind of forcing the vice president's hand into now becoming the leader?
The installing of that, the way I think about, and I could be wrong because again, I can't read the minds of other individuals, but it's to justify, oh, look, the same bad regime is still in power.
I don't even know. I wish I could read their minds because, my immediate thought was regime change. We already know regime changes don't work. But you're right. When they're just re-putting in the same government, I don't know. But how does, if their point is trying to say, well, see, it's still the same old government that you had before, how do you think that there just isn't a plan for, moving past Maduro?
Yeah,
Is it
the plan is having Venezuela as a U.S. territory, right? Or not even a territory, just as a possession. That is the
right?
plan. It was just said, right? The plan is to have, at best that I could speculate, Marco Rubio be the president of Venezuela. I'm not even joking, right?
I know you're not joking.
He
I'm
hinted at
laughing because it's
himself
true.
and Marco
Right.
Rubio, in a sense, being the individual who runs Venezuela. And certainly Marco Rubio himself would like to run Cuba based off his own rhetoric, right? He's been frothing at the mouth his whole political career. And
Right.
as a Cubano, right? And, I am very anti-Maduro. Again, I agree with Anna Navarro on the son of a bitch, to put it lightly. My own abuela, were individuals who were labeled as counter-revolutionary. My abuela was briefly, right? I can name again and again. But at the same sort of time, right, you don't want to replace communism with fascism. Even Jose Marti, right, talked about the United States being a tiger, right, being, a sort of entity that could do a lot of harm, right? This sort of Jose Marti had this concern of, great, we got rid of Spanish imperialism, right? Do not trade, that for the tiger of America. And so in this regard, right, that is the concern I have. And the bigger concern I have, it is not just neoliberal America that's being traded out for, which has its own problems, but we're talking about blatantly fascist America. We're talking mask off 100 styles imperialism. We're not pretending that we don't have an empire, right? We are going, no, no, no. The empire is back and we're, for Trump, we're going to make it bigger than ever before. When fascists talk about bestness, well, bestness doesn't have a straightforward, definition. Best could mean whatever you want it
Right.
to mean. And right now, for this week, bestness is, America's the best because we are, the most militarily capable of building a regional hegemonic empire.
Right. So some of the things I've been seeing online include, Maduro as a victim. He was a victim of U.S. sanctions. How can you expect him to do anything else when these sanctions were crippling? Things kind of along that line. What do you make of that rhetoric? Who in your mind is kind of thinking like that?
I mean, the most obvious group to be thinking like that are, communists and socialists, right? Individuals who are ideologically in these camps. And at the end of the day, right, as a social democrat, I have disagreements with, communists and socialists, right? Unlike fascists, I do think there are limited communists and socialists who are well-intentioned, right? And limited could even potentially be a majority, but that aside, right? My thing, I think, with you know, Chavez's and Maduro's economic planning, right? It was entirely reliant on oil, right? So it was just a one commodity reliant economic plan. We saw this with Cuba also during the forced sugarcane harvesting, right? The, Cuban people being forced to, cut sugarcane, and that didn't economically work, right? You cannot have an economy that relies on one commodity. And, you could see Saudi Arabia and the UAE again and again trying to get out of being a single commodity state. So this is why a country like Iran, while certainly they have many struggles given U.S. sanctions, they still have many functioning aspects of their economy, especially in comparison to a state like Venezuela. So to say it's entirely the fault of U.S. sanctions, I will certainly agree and be like, yeah, U.S. sanctions do no favors for Cuba, do no
Right.
favors for Venezuela, do no favors for Iran. I'm ultimately in favor of getting rid of the embargo on Cuba. I think having them as a terrorist state is absolutely absurd. But that all being said, sanctions are, you know, are a tool that only makes life worse for individuals within a country. They do not help an economy. There are decisions that Chavez and Maduro could have certainly made. So again, it's one of these things where it's not just like all this, all that, right? There is unfortunate, wrongs on multiple ends, right? A series of mutual catastrophes that just end up hurting individuals again and again. These cycles of hurt, the hurt people begetting hurt people here.
Right. Well, and one of the things I remember from, God, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago now, was when Venezuela had their like big economic crisis. And the news and the talking points was people are eating rats in the street. And, we can never have a socialist government because this is what it leads to. Like, how does things like sanctions and that kind of rhetoric, like, how does that actually affect everyday Venezuelans compared to those in power?
Well, I think we don't even need to have it be a socialist state. We could just look at any state, right? You can look at, Miami as a very fine example of this, right? You could look at the existence of Star Island, and then you can just go to like Miami Gardens or Florida City, right? Again, and even that, right? Then you can then compare, something like Star Island to Alexandria, Louisiana, right? Or once again, you can compare, Star Island to, veteran homelessness in LA, right? So to point to say, yes, the wealth disparities are only in this one place. No, that's absurd. This is a global issue. This is a global travesty that we as a species allow for this, that we don't use the organizational tools that we have to take care of the members of our species when, right, if we had, given that we have the, technology to produce enough food for everyone, to distribute enough food and medicine for individuals, and yet, there are choices not to again and again, right? That is
Right.
the real travesty therein. And so this is not to say that the economic conditions were not worse in Venezuela, right? That there isn't a higher proportion of poverty, of desperation, hunger. Of course, that would be absurd for me, not to say. But, this is a global catastrophe of allowing people throughout the world to live in conditions where they don't have access to basic goods when we have the ability to do so, right? We're looking at past, generations and technological periods. Oh, yes, this was not possible to get food to everyone, to get water to everyone, right? Of course. But given the infrastructural existences we have now, it's simply not morally justified in my, hopefully humble opinion.
So let's go back to 3 months ago. The US has been striking boats off the coast of Venezuela since what, roughly September? Where do you view like all the boat strikes? How does that kind of play into this whole story as it's evolved over the last few days?
I want to go much further back with this. I'm really with Kyle
That's okay.
Kalinske
Take us
on
there.
on this one. Notice that the boat strikes were also in the Pacific, right? The boat strikes were not just Atlantic boat strikes, right? We have our military stationed on both sides of the northern Latin America, right? On both sides of the canal, on both sides of Colombia, both sides of Mexico, right? The current U.S. military is set up to essentially control the entire, you know, Caribbean region, right? The countries that border the Caribbean. So to me, right, the initial boat strikes are to set up that justification for while we're there. But, even an MSNBC commentator could figure out, that seems like a lot of boats to get dinghies off of Trinidad and Tobago, because it's not
Right.
for that. It is literally for imperialistic purposes, right? I'm sure, for anyone who comments, right, I'm going to probably get comments of, you're being too much, you're being irrational. And I am okay with being, you know, wrong on this. I hope I am wrong on this front.
Right.
But it is a present possibility given the way things are angled and set up. And again, the continual existent rhetoric, not just from 3 months ago, but, Trump right before getting into office, talking about getting back the Panama Canal, right? Republicans for
Forgot
years
about
since
that one.
2016 talking about doing bombing raids
Right.
into Mexico, right? Marco Rubio being blatant on Cuba, right? So what we are set up for is a military domination of the entire Pacific. We have 1/3 of our whole fleet there, most of our aircraft carriers. We are set up to bomb the hell out of this region, right? And ultimately, the United States, is arrogant enough to think that it can capture all of these countries at once. And quite frankly, right, in a sense, I do not know the abilities of the Panamanian military, but they're probably closer to Venezuela's than they are to China's.
Right. One of the things that I keep getting comments of on my own videos is it's 2 words. All it says is Monroe Doctrine. How do you think that plays into? Well, first, can you give us a brief overview on what the Monroe Doctrine is? And
Well, it's now the
second,
Monroe Doctrine, okay? Get it right. It's
correct.
the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah.
And then can we talk about, why is that being used as a defense, as like why this is okay?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird sense, the Monroe Doctrine was set up by the British, right? So what you have is, you know, President Monroe basically saying, hey, Eurasia, mostly Europe, do not intervene in the Americas. We are going to protect the newly independent states of the Americas. Don't intervene. Now, when the United States said this, the United States was not amongst the great powers. So it's certainly equivalent to the power of some European nations like Italy, but certainly not a great power. Did not have the means to stop France or Germany from, meddling in the Americas. Actually, at this time would be Prussia, but nonetheless, right? So what you have therein is the United States being unable to stop a great power like Prussia or Austria-Hungary from intervening, but still making this statement, a statement enforced by the British Empire. The British had interest in ensuring that the Americas were free of any other European interests. And, we're basically saying, hey, we're going to protect America's claim on its sphere of influence, even though the spear at this point in time was shared by the United States and Britain, right? As well play off the United States to give yourself more domination in the region. But this culminated also around the time of Manifest Destiny. This idea starts to form around this time too. And so what you really have here is these combination ideas that, hey, the United States, has control of this region, right? This being put into the psyche, this being put into the textbooks. Whether or not the United States has always gone about the Monroe Doctrine is irrelevant, right? It's part of the American cultural zeitgeist. And, right, it's part of the ways in which the United States has, justified other states not participating in the Western Hemisphere, like the Soviets with Cuba, like China with, Venezuela and Nicaragua. So what you have here is this principle that doesn't inherently stand on any legs now that the British are unable to, do anything in the sphere, right? The
Right.
United States took on the mandate of the Monroe Doctrine. And you have Donald Trump saying, hey, I want to kick the Monroe Doctrine into overdrive. I want to put it on steroids and have it be the Don Roe Doctrine, right? That the United States hyperdrive gets to have its sphere of the Western Hemisphere. Not only can nobody touch it, but now the United States is in direct control of much of that sphere, right? I don't think Canadians should be, restful now that like Trump hasn't talked about Canada as much anymore, right? If I was
Right.
Canadian, if I'm a there is still that concern of America acting without rationality, to
Right.
put it lightly.
Right. For many people don't know the history of American intervention anywhere south of the border. Like, for a lot of people, the only thing they know is the Monroe Doctrine. And there's this tendency to just kind of collapse all these separate countries into just one big conglomerate. What do you think when that happens, when it's collapsed into just South America, the Caribbean? What gets lost when Venezuela is treated as a political talking point instead of a country with real people?
I mean, my novia is Mexicana, right? And we will talk, about the ways, jokingly, how, the United States will be like so beholden to its land, right? Like, oh, this is Texas, this is California, and it's like, wait, no, that was Mexico, right? So this sort of thing, though, right? I think even when it comes to the Mexican-American War, right, people kind of know it, but there's this sort of way in which people purposely try to not even forget history, but doomer about history, point to its, inherent irrelevancy. So for, Americans, right, and for many other imperial areas, right, kind of even ignoring, but disregarding the history of other places and conglomerating it allows it to just be a commodity that can be taken due to our own interest and want and desires. One of the things that the very first prime minister of Singapore talked about, he talked about Americans as brash but unwise. And this mentality, I think, is very true for the United States. We want it, we'll get it, right? And that's just kind of, been the American mentality, and that idea was propagated very much by the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. So for Americans, it doesn't matter the subtleties of El Salvador versus Honduras. It doesn't matter the subtleties of Cuba and Venezuela or Colombia's differences with Ecuador. What matters is, this would be nice to put in my shopping basket. This would be nice to add to my cart. And I'm not saying that's like individuals in like Louisiana or Oklahoma. That's more so, governmental and corporate interest, this
Right.
sort of way of, using the military as a tool so Peter Thiel can have a private city or so Chevron can, up its stock.
Right. Well, that's one of my favorite pieces of history is the Banana Wars in the 1930s. The more you're talking, the more I'm leaning away from this. But originally, I was like, this is so reminding me of the Banana Wars because it's just meant to deepen the interests of U.S. companies, which is insane. The Banana Wars were an insane thing to do, and we're just repeating it.
But not even just like in Central America, right? That's Chiquita banana in Central America, right? But Chiquita was there, and then the Dole Fruit Company also helped with the takeover of the Kingdom of Hawaii, right? So like in that sort of sense, like that was Dole also played an interested part. But what we have there is, yes, actually, I don't think it's wrong to move away from the banana war stuff, but it's the banana companies, the modern banana companies, Chevron, and the oil companies, right? They're not leading the effort to get the United States in. They are happenstantial beneficiaries of fascist expansionism. And again, you can notice that like instead of the commodities being the main driver, they're used as another means to justify, right? Like, oh, we have to go in there because of narco-terrorism, because of the oil, and because of the truthful suffering of Venezuelan individuals and the ideological disagreements, right? What they are doing is building up justifications, right? It just so happens that the Banana Wars one is not the main driver or propagator. It is another means to justify American action. Like, oh, no worries. The corporations will go in there and this will help with American greatness.
Right. And what do you make of the kind of comparisons that we're seeing to the war in Iraq? I've seen a couple people say, the Bush presidency primed us for years before we marched into Iraq and Afghanistan, whereas this kind of seems to, at least to the casual observer, have happened overnight. What do you make of that comparison?
Yeah, because they're fundamentally different. I think, like, again, you have neocon justification, which is horrible. Like, Dick Cheney is one of the biggest war criminals in American history, right? The lives of millions of innocent individuals are on his hands, right? So this is not to go like, oh, neoconservatism. No, it's It's a horrible and vicious ideology in its own right. Right. And again, these are different types of viciousness that still result in human suffering. Right. Fascists don't need to make these justifications. Right. If you look at the history of the Anschluss and the Sudetenland, they're relatively quick. And, there isn't a super long time, like there isn't a years long campaign of going, hey, everybody, we should
Right.
have the Sudetenland. I mean, there is some time, spent, but really at the end of the day, right, fascists operate a lot quicker in these regards. Like, we want it, we will have it. There's this building up of general ideological justification for fascism, but
Right.
not over specific targets. When you convince a population we're the best, we need to do whatever we can to, be the best, then all you have to do is, once you get people on board with the ideology, then the ideologues simply need to act. And so, yeah, there wasn't a need to spend a lot of time justifying. All you have to do is then, just act because you can. I think Lines on Map, a good YouTuber, points to this well. States act because they can, right? They don't act because it's like, oh no, a precedent has been set, right? It's not like China's not invading Taiwan because of precedent, or Russia isn't trying to kidnap Zelensky because of precedent. No, clearly China wants to invade Taiwan. Russia wants to kidnap Zelensky, but they don't have the power to do so. What the United States is doing in this case, emboldened by fascist ideologies, acting on the power that it has and has had for a long time, right? Actually not having certain moral compunctions or beliefs, unlike
Hmm.
other administrations, which were still horrible in many rights, but now you have a more blatant imperialistic set of beliefs running the U.S. executive branch.
Right. So, what are you kind of hearing from the Venezuelan community here in Miami, at least, about like what are they feeling? I see so many people, especially in comment sections again, kind of trying to speak for Venezuelans. And what are you hearing? Like, what are your kind of concrete experiences on this?
No, I mean, it is mostly that. Like, most of the Venezuelan diaspora is pumped about it. Even my own Novia's family was like, yeah, like, I hope the US like takes care of the cartels, right? So there are many people in, at least, the community here in South Florida, that are very on board. I would personally argue there's not a lot of thinking about the future therein. But again, I can't deny it. But it's not a universal thing. My own grandparents, who, Goanos, right? They're concerned themselves about what this leads to in, the future. So it's not a universal feeling, but it's definitely the majority of South Floridians are completely on board with this set of actions, and not really a lot of talk about the running the country statements, right? That kind of is getting pushed to the side,
Right.
which again makes a lot
Well,
of
do you
sense,
think
right? Because
that's like a they're not thinking about it yet? Like the
no,
excitement of Maduro being out is obviously exciting, but do you think it's something that would shift in the future?
no. I mean, people have greatly suffered under Maduro. Again, I have, individuals I know in my life that like have fled the country, right? One
Right.
out of asylum, the other out of economic reasons. And, when it comes to the Mexican cartels, they've done a ton of damage to individuals. So what this is individuals who have lived in the United States, have benefited from the United States, right? The United States has been good to my family. I have 3 grandparents who immigrated in. So,
Right.
so the United States in many ways has been good to, not all, obviously there's a lot of history of xenophobia, but again, complicated, right? So in that regard, individuals who, have been able to build a new life in the United States want that brought over to their countries that are not
I see.
doing as well, right? So fuck the cartels, screw Maduro, right? Like, like that's the thing in mind, because those are the things that brought them pain in the first place. Those are the things that took them away from their home countries. Many Cubanos feel the same way, want Cuba to be next. And because of the true and existent pain that the Cuban Communist Party brought upon many Cubanos, right? So they're not thinking in advance. It's just this like, like, my enemy is gone, I shall celebrate. And there's an optimism around it. And I hope,
Right.
again, individuals in my community are correct about their optimism, and my deep pessimism is wrong. I'm again, my analysis is very different. I want, again, the cartels to be gone, Maduro to be gone, the Communist Party to be gone. The individuals taking them out, I do not think have the any good intentions.
Right. Well, I hope you're wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Like, I hope the US isn't an occupying force, but it's, I see both sides of it. I understand why people are excited. I'm excited for them. I'm happy to see people celebrating about it, but it's, again, my perspective is uniquely American. It's hard for me not to think of the American history and what we've done in the past and how never once has something like this ended in a pleasant and good way.
But many individuals in Latin America want to be a part of the U.S. There's a joke in Latin America that Miami is the capital of the Latin world. And in many ways, that's true. We are, like, Miami is in many ways the financial capital of Latin America because it's a bridge, right, between the U.S. markets and, Latin markets, right? And again, this is overgeneralizing. It's not universal, but it's a sentiment found a lot, right? A lot of people look at the U.S. as, the city, the shining city on the hill, right? And movies and economics and like family, right? There is, that doesn't exist for no reason. Again, not a universal feeling, but one that exists to a large enough proportion. And so there actually are individuals who are like, well, whatever about the U.S., imperial history, they're stable, they're rich, they provide opportunities. And again, that's what most people want. Most people want to be able to lead a good life. My concern therein about U.S. occupation is a Puerto Ricanizing of the Latin world, which will lead to some better lives for some individuals. But if you look at Puerto Rico, its infrastructure is just way off from the rest of the continental United States and the other two U.S. states. And what you have is Puerto Rico acting as a colony of the U.S., still the longest running colony. And, that's obviously a contentious thing to talk about with Puerto Ricans, right? When I bring that up, some get where I'm coming from. Some are greatly annoyed, right? Because Puerto Ricans see themselves as having a nation. And that is obviously 100% valid. But the manner that it is run, de jure is as a colony.
So one last question before we go. As we've talked about, there's just different news stories and perspectives coming out. It seems like every other minute at this point. If Americans are wanting to understand Venezuela, its people, its history, what it is as a country, beyond these archaic kind of Cold War style talking points, what should people be paying attention to?
I think what is best to pay attention to is that sort of spirit of Simon Bolivar. Not to say that he was a perfect individual, but looking at the ways in which many of the countries of South America freed themselves from the Spanish Empire. There is a reason why Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela have similar flags. The nation of Pan Colombia, right? And sort of viewing Venezuela, not as a Cold War state, but as a country in continual revolutionary change and and then counter-revolutionary change and et cetera, right? So I think it's more interesting to think about Venezuela, having that sort of, history repeat itself again and again. And what you potentially have, with new U.S. action, what you could end up with is another period of, counter-revolutionary thinking or a resparking of new types of revolutionary thinking, right? Because there certainly is a spirit of independence that runs in, Venezuela. If you go to Doral, right, there is a proudness of being Venezuelan, right? And Venezuelans know their history well beyond the Cold War. So I think that's potentially useful frame to think about Venezuela rather than thinking about it as a Russian puppet state, thinking about it as a place with a complicated ebbing and flowing history with a lot of fervor and pride.
Right. Well, that's just something that's been irritating me a lot, is that people have just been boiling Venezuela down to just what's happened in the last 48 hours, which is crazy to me. Like you said, there's a rich, hundreds of years long history behind Venezuela that people just don't really seem to want to acknowledge.
No, and it's not beneficial to acknowledge that because Venezuela is place ran by evil idiot, and therefore, we can decide what happens with this place. And The thing that I guess disgusts me the most, right, is not the most, there's many things that disgust me, but disgusts me the most about the internal U.S. politics is the way that Venezuelans as individuals are being weaponized by places like Fox News. 1 minute, they're all members of Tren de Agua. The next minute, let's go to Doral and look how happy they are, right? So the way in which people are used opportunistically as objects for desire, right? And objects for the desire to enact out violence in very Lacanian ways.
I had actually completely forgot that the whole Aurora, Colorado, the eating animals in Ohio. I forgot that Trump had said that was Venezuelan gangs.
Well, no, the eating of the cats and dogs was Haitians in Springfield,
correct.
Ohio.
You were correct. My bad.
But nonetheless, right, repeated Tren de Agua. I mean, again,
right.
I spoke very, earlier about, someone who sought asylum from Venezuela, right? Because they were a journalist, right, that reported negatively on Maduro, they were found to be, having a valid asylum claim, but still facing that unforeseen threat of their existence within the country. So it's a sort of sense of, oh, right, these people are bad and we don't want them here. Also, and I guess I should have had number 5 earlier, right, using that as another justification to invade this place. They're sending their people from mental institutes and insane asylums, right? Obviously inappropriate terms for, mental health, but, of course he's not going to care about the subtleties of that because, no, these are evil objects sent over, treating people as such.
Right. All right. Well, that is all that I have for you. Thank you very much for coming back on and
thank you for
giving
having
this
me.
little. Yeah, of course. I'm so, like I said, this was not my kind of focus in school, so I feel like I learned a lot, and I've kind of got a little more fight left in me about how can we stop the U.S. from colonizing Venezuela?
Yeah, I guess my plan is not to necessarily convince. It's the frame I have. I can understand disagreements with the frame, but those are the dots that I'm connecting.
I'm seeing your dots.
And I think they're important to think about, right? Whether, again, as a hopefully wrong about the case scenario, but the dots are not unconnectable, which that's the scary part in of itself, that you can even make an argument for these sorts of dots.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again. It was great to have you on again.
Thank you as always, Paige.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I really hope this shed some light on what is going on in Venezuela and kind of cleared some things up. Like I said at the top, I know that there's a lot of information swirling around, and as I mentioned in the episode, a lot of people just think, oh, Monroe Doctrine, and then that's the only talking point or thought that they have about it, so I feel like this was a really good refresher, if not dive into what's going on, and I feel like I walked away learning a lot as well. But yeah, I think that's all I have for you guys. We will be back to the regularly scheduled Candidate Month episodes. I've still got 3 more to go. I couldn't even stay away for a week, but that's okay because this was incredibly important to do. The other thing that launched on the 1st of January was my Substack, which is called She Knows the Score. And so that's a thing now. Very fun and exciting, and I have another one coming out on the 15th and another one on February 3rd, I think. So this is very fun and exciting. I didn't think of myself to be much of a writer, but when I have an idea that I want to expand on, I found that it's pretty easy to expand on it, which is why I already have one written for February 3rd. But that's it. So if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. To support this podcast, you can also subscribe to my Substack, She Knows the Score, which is linked in the show notes. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and let's pray that Anthony is not correct this time. I will see you guys in 2 days, since this was a bonus episode. Bye!